Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about introduction of angle relationships. So before we begin, we have to make sure that we know all the different parts of an angle. So an angle consists of three main parts. It consists of two legs, so they're on the sides, and one vertex that connects them at a point. Let's take a look at some other important vocabulary. Okay, let's take a look at some key definitions. When we're talking about angles and their relationships, we have four major relationships that we're going to discuss. The first of the relationship is when we're talking about complementary angles. Complementary angles are two angles whose sum have a measure of 90 degrees. So two angles whose measures have a sum of 90 degrees. So for example, here we've got 65 degrees and 25 degrees. When you add those together, they give us 90, so therefore our angle relationship, these are both complementary, these two angles add up to be 90. Let's take a look at the next one. So the next one is supplementary, and there we have two angles whose sum is a total of 180 degrees. So this time we're going to have two angles, and we add them together, that's going to equal 180 degrees. So 75 plus 105 there are going to give us 180. So that's another angle relationship that's very important. The third angle relationship that we're going to talk about is when we have two angles who are side by side and they have a common vertex and side. They may or may not be congruent. These angles are known as adjacent. Adjacent just means next to, but it doesn't have any specific particular relationship that makes it important, other than the fact that they share a vertex and they share a side. So that again is adjacent. Our last angle relationship is where we have two angles formed by intersecting lines, and they are always congruent and always equivalent. And when we have these type of angles, they're called vertical angles. They don't have to be on top of each other up and down like you would think vertically. They could also be across, but vertical angles are always equivalent and always congruent. So for example, our example down there has 146 degrees and 146 degrees. They're across from each other, so they're vertical angles, they're equal, and they're congruent. Same thing with the 34s. The lines intersect, and it made two angles that are congruent and equivalent. The two 34s are across from each other, they're equal, and they're congruent. So now that we know these four major angle relationships, let's talk about how we can apply them in problems. So here this problem asks us to identify the angle relationships, and it says highlight all the pairs of complementary angles. So I have to remember the relationship that means complementary angles. So if I remember this correctly, it's two angles that are equal to 90 degrees. Now I have a little trick to remember which one is 90 degrees and which one is 180 degrees, complementary versus supplementary. And the way that I do that is I draw a little line down from the C so that my complementary there makes a 90 at the very beginning. So it makes a 90, so that's how I know that complementary means 90 degrees. Is this something that you have to use? No, but it's a good little trick. So let's take a look at all of our examples here and determine which ones are complementary. So if I take a look at 18 and 72, I'm going to add those together and see if they equal 90. So 8 plus 72 gives me 80, plus another 10 is 90. So yes, these two angles equal 90 degrees, so therefore I know that they're complementary. 38 and 38 don't add together to give me 90, so they're not complementary. 34 and 66 add to 100, so they're not complementary. 45 plus 45 does equal 90, so they're complementary. 30 plus 150 gives me 180, so they are supplementary. However, I'm only looking for problems that are complementary, so I cannot highlight them. So only the two there are the correct answers. Let's take a look at the next one. So our next slide here tells us to identify the angle relationships. Highlight all the pairs that are supplementary angles. So again, I have to remember that supplementary angles are two angles that equal 180 degrees. So now I'm going to go through and highlight all the ones that equal 180 degrees. So two right angles. So if I had two right angles, those would both be 90. So 90 plus 90 would equal 180. So those are supplementary. 12 plus 168 would give me 180, so those are supplementary. 100 plus 100 gives me 200, so that is not supplementary. 20 plus 70 gives me 90, so that is not supplementary. That would be complementary. They add up to 90, but that's not what I'm looking for. And if I get 127 and 53, They add up to 180, so they are supplementary. So I'll highlight them as well. So now I know which ones are supplementary. Let's take a look at the next one. So the next one tells us to identify the angle relationships using pictures. So this time we've got a picture and we have to determine which ones match all of the things or select all of the things that describe these angles. So for example here I've got two angles that are across from each other. They're equal, but they don't appear to add up to 90. They don't add up to 100. So let's see what they are. So they do add up, or they are congruent because they are the same. So we'll say they're congruent. That's true. They're across from each other, so that makes them vertical. So we've got that as well. All right, are they complementary? No, they don't add up to 90. Supplementary? No, they don't add up to 90. Adjacent? No, they don't share a side or a vertex, so that makes them non-adjacent because they don't share that side and vertex. So vertical, non-adjacent, and congruent are the three things for the first one. The second one, let's take a look over here. Complementary, do they add up to 90? No, that's not true. 118 plus 62, they add up to 180, so that's supplementary. Good. Do they share a side and vertex? Yeah, they do, right in the middle, so that makes them adjacent. They're not vertical because they're not across from each other. Since we just said they are adjacent, they can't be non-adjacent, and they're not the same measure, so they're not congruent. So we've figured out all the things that they are while also eliminating the things that they're not. It's very important to both be able to identify the things that they are as well as be able to identify the things they are not. Let's take a look at the next one. So again, we've got another example that says identify the angle relationships using the pictures. Highlight all the words that describe the angles shown. So I want you to try this one on your own. Go ahead and pause the video, figure out the ones that are right, then press play again to see if you are right. How did you do? Do your answers match mine? Notice the first one, the only thing they were is adjacent. I know that seems odd, but they're not equal, they don't add up to anything, they're not across from each other, so the only thing they can be is adjacent. The second one, on the other hand, they're not adjacent, obviously, so they're nowhere near each other, but they do have the same measure, so they're congruent, and 45 plus 45 equals 90, so they are complementary. Let's take a look at the next one. So the next thing they're asking us to do is finding the missing measure. So it's going to give us one measure and it's going to tell us something about what the angle relationship. We're going to use what we know about angle relationships to find the piece that is missing. So in this case it says angle A and B are vertical and angle A is 32 degrees. What is the measure of angle B? So I don't have to do any math, I just have to remember the relationship of vertical angles. And I know that vertical angles are congruent and they're also equivalent, which means if angle A is 32 degrees, then angle B is also 30 degrees. Then it says, what is the measure of the angle that is complementary to 71 degrees? So again, I have to remember my angle relationships, so I know that complementary means two angles that add up to be 90 degrees. So I am going to have to do some math here, because I've got 90 and they gave me 71. So I'm going to subtract the 90 from 71 from 90. And when I do that, 90 minus 71 is 19. So I know that my answer is 19 degrees. The last one says, what is the value of x? So I have to take a look at my picture. I've got 65 on one side and x on the other, but I notice that there's a line that's straight across and they're combined. They're going to equal 180 degrees, so I know they're supplementary. So if I know they're going to equal 180 degrees, I can do 180 minus 65, and when I do that, the leftover is 115 degrees. So I know my answer is 115 degrees. Let's take a look at the next one. So this time it's talking about finding measure, and I want you to find the missing measure for yourself. So I want you to pause the video, remember what you know about angle relationships, use them to get the correct answer, and then press play again to see if you are right. How did you do? Were you able to get all of the correct answers? Did you use vertical and complementary and supplementary to figure out the correct answers? If you did, go ahead and move on to the next one. If not, go back and check to see what you did wrong. So let's take a look at some practical problems. So where can we use these angles in word problems, more or less? So the first one says, two wires are holding a hot air balloon in place. What is the value of x? So notice that the hot air balloon, they made two angles that intersect. So I know when two angles intersect, you're going to have vertical angles that are going to be equal. So I know that if one angle is 23 degrees, the other angle is going to be 23 degrees. That's pretty easy. However, let's take a look at the next one. Next one says, in Math Town, Forest Lane and Main Street intersect. The angles are at the northwest corner of 78 degrees. What is the angle of the northeast corner? So where we mess this up most is we're not really sure where the directions are, northwest, northeast. So I'm going to take out my little compass here, or my little let me know which is northwest, northeast, etc., etc. So since I'm looking for northwest, I notice that that's at the upper left-hand corner. So the upper left-hand corner of my street, I'm going to label 78 degrees. So that's my northwest street. It says, then I'm looking for the one that is northeast. So again, I'm going to look at northeast on my compass. So that appears to be right here. So I've got my 78 degrees labeled and my X labeled. And I notice that those two angles make across a straight line. So they're going to be supplementary. They're going to equal 180 degrees. To figure out what X is, I'm going to take 180 minus my 78 degrees. And when I do that, I'm left over with 102 degrees. So my answer is 102 degrees. This brings us to the end of part 1. If you like this part, remember to throw us a thumbs up. If you love this, throw us a sub.